Thanks for watching. I'm Jim Falk. The Biden administration recently announced major steps to get us out of gasoline powered vehicles and into EVs, electric vehicles, with the goal of having 67% of passenger car and light duty truck sales being electric by 2032. That's certainly a heavy lift. Since last year, only 5.8% of vehicles sold were electric. In today's program, we discuss whether this ambitious goal is attainable. Will there be enough charging stations? Is the electrical grid large and stable enough to power the anticipated growth? And where will the rare materials needed to manufacture the batteries come from? And lastly, who's going to foot the bill? To discuss this and more, we are joined by Timothy Johnson, who's a professor of practice of energy and environment at Duke University. Among his many areas of expertise is energy planning for the changing environment of consumption. And coming from Austin is Robert Bryce. He's the author of 6 books, including his latest, A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations, and the producer of a feature film and the host of the Power Hungry podcast. Welcome, gentlemen. Great to have you with us. And this certainly is a timely topic. I cannot believe the number of headlines I saw just over the last 24 hours. But going back just a few years, Robert, you wrote a piece, and the title of it was, It's Time to Unplug the Hype Over Electric Vehicles. Do you still feel as strongly?
Well, first, I'll gladly concede, Jim, that there's no doubt that EV sales are growing. And you pointed out 6% of EV sales last year, 6% of all U.S. car sales were EVs. But remember, this isn't a new technology. We've been hearing about electric vehicles for more than a century. Here's a quote from the Los Angeles Times. The electric automobile will quickly and easily take precedence over all other kinds of motor carriages as soon as an effective battery of lightweight is discovered. That was in 1901. Here's the Washington Post, 1915. Prices of electric cars will continue to drop until they are within reach of the average family. Well, they're still not within reach of the average family. So, yes, I think there's a lot of hype around EVs, and glad to discuss those things. But I think the key challenges, really, very quickly, are price, grid constraints, and supply chains. And the last one in particular is a really sticky one because it involves cobalt from Congo, and then more broadly, critical minerals from China.
Well, Tim, Robert has certainly brought up some really important obstacles, these headwinds. How do you see it? What are the most critical headwinds that we got to go against?
I would agree in large part. And I'll just add too, in 1911, electric vehicle sales outnumbered both steam-powered vehicles and vehicles with internal combustion engines. I think internal combustion engine vehicles were last. If you imagine having steam vehicles on the road. So certainly the grid upgrades on the distribution side especially. Then building out charger network. Minerals is interesting because there are different battery chemistries out there, not all of which rely on cobalt, for instance, which is certainly problematic. There's no argument there. But other battery chemistries within the lithium-ion family, which is what electric vehicles have today, that rely, for instance, on phosphorus and iron, minerals that are more plentiful. And then there are, beyond lithium-ion batteries, you have the possibility of sodium batteries, and sodium is a much more plentiful mineral. All battery chemistries have trade-offs. Some do well on some attributes like cost. Others do better on attributes like energy density, which gives you the long range.
I'd like to ask you to really focus on this issue of charging stations. I often drive long distances, and I'm still not seeing on some of the off the main roads charging stations. And the administration has said, let's just look at California. How are they going to get enough charging stations to meet the demand that they're trying to get in California?
Well, sure, of course. So I think that the availability of charging is only one of the challenges, Jim. And yes, it's a big one. And remember, most homeowners don't have the capability to charge their vehicle at home. And so they'll have to use public charging stations. But let's talk about let's talk about the grid for just a minute. We don't have enough transformers. I wrote a piece recently on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, talking about the fact that today, for distribution transformers, the wait times can be 2 years. So the availability of the charging is only one issue, but the other issue with the charging is the wait time itself. Remember, when we travel, we seldom say, oh, it's 2 miles away or 5 miles away. Say, no, it's going to take you 20 minutes. It's going to take you an hour. We don't measure our travel budgets in terms of distance. We measure them in time. And so that's the key issue as well with these EVs. They take a long time to travel. That's why when you're driving from Santa Fe, you don't want to stop at Buc-ee's and you can get your beef jerky and your gasoline in about 10 minutes. You don't want to sit at Buc-ee's in Madisonville, Texas for 2 or 3 hours. You want to get back down the road.
One of the things that I'm confused about is like when I fill up my combustion engine car, I end up paying somewhere between 20 cents if I'm in Texas, or if I'm in California, 60 cents tax per gallon. So how does that work if you've got an EV? Who is going to pay for the maintenance of the roads, the bridges, and the rest of the infrastructure?
That's an open question, and it actually depends on the state, the state policy right now. Some states, add an annual fee to the registration of, for EV owners that's meant to make up for that lost tax revenue at the pump. That varies state to state, and some states don't, deliberately, as a way of incentivizing EV purchases. This is a big issue, but it's also an issue with internal combustion engine vehicles as they become more efficient. If all we had were gasoline-powered cars and, say, the corporate average fuel economy standards increased, well, they're using less gasoline per mile, and you have a decline in tax revenue, which, by the way, was never indexed for inflation and isn't adequate to cover our needs as it is.
I'd jump in here for a second, Jim, and I think, one of the issues for me that really just keeps coming up when you think about EVs in the future is a matter of equity in terms of who pays. And remember, the average household income for an EV buyer is something on the order of $140,000 a year. That's twice the average household income in the U.S. The EVs are being bought by the Benz and Beamer crowd. The AP just had a piece that was just published in the last couple of days.
Yeah, but Robert, the response to that is that a lot of the manufacturers are coming out now, they say, with EVs that are going to cost $26,000, $30,000.
Sure, that's what they say, and that may well happen. But remember, Ford just a few days ago also announced they admitted they're losing $34,000 on every EV they make. That is not sustainable. And how are they making that happen? They're subsidizing their loss-making EVs with the production of internal combustion engines. That's in fact the history of Tesla. How did Tesla even make it? They're getting subsidies, effectively credits from other auto manufacturers. That's what's been the fuel for Tesla. It hasn't necessarily been consumer pull. So there are class issues here, both about the price availability and also the fact that other motorists are effectively subsidizing EV drivers by paying for EV infrastructure, to taxpayers paying for EV infrastructure. So there are a lot of class issues here that I think are being ignored.
And then am I correct in this, is that some of the less expensive cars are going to not be able to go as far? So that when you pay the $60,000 for your Tesla, that's where you maybe get your 300, 350 miles. But if you're looking at the VW that's $26,000, you may only be able to go 200 miles.
Well, and that may be fine for a lot of people who just live in the city and only travel in the city. I mean, I have a vehicle, and a lot of my travel is right here in town. So I don't necessarily need a vehicle that has 100 miles of range. But remember, all of this, again, assumes that we have a grid that is robust enough to handle all of this new demand. We forget the staggering amount of energy that is consumed in the form of liquid hydrocarbons, and in particular, gasoline and diesel fuel. And to put all of that demand on the grid is an incredible challenge.
Tim, you are, in a sense, a professor of public policy. And, I'm okay with carrots, reduce cost and lower prices and all that. But now it seems that the administration is, I might say, wielding a heavy stick to encourage people to ditch their gasoline cars and go EV. Do you think this is the way to go?
So just to build on that, and what the administration is doing is tightening the EPA's tailpipe CO2 emission standards. So most people don't realize that the EPA actually does regulate CO2 emissions from tailpipes of vehicles, and so the amount of CO2 you can emit per mile is going down under the regulations that kick in 2027. It's aspirational. I mean, a lot of things have to fall into place to make this work. building out charging networks. The big thing will be sourcing minerals for batteries and building out the battery supply chain, particularly if you layer in the Inflation Reduction Act's requirements that those critical minerals come from either the US or countries with which we have free trade agreements, and then those batteries then be assembled in North America. That supply chain does not exist right now. And people are going to have to, tolerate a lot more mining activity simply to reach the sales targets, that were really required to meet these new standards.
Well, these EPA aspirational goals were just announced in essentially mid-April. What type of opposition do you think there'll be to those, Robert? And will they stick?
Well, the initial comments from the big automakers, Stellantis and others, has been, well, wait just a minute here. I mean, they're already facing a lot of constraints in terms of their new capacity, and they're investing billions of dollars. GM is saying they're going to quit building internal combustion engines. What I fear here, Jim, is that the taxpayer is going to end up, the consumer is going to end up paying the bill if all this ends in tears because of increasing costs of batteries, because of supply chain constraints. And to build on what Tim said, the amount of mining involved here is just staggering. The mineral intensity, last year, the International Energy Agency released a report that talked about the material intensity of EVs and alternative energy in general. The average EV contains over 200 kilograms of critical metals, copper being one of the big ones, lithium, manganese, nickel. And who dominates the supply chain for all of those metals? It's, of course, China. And I'm going to mention cobalt one more time because the IEA also said it was 13 kilograms of cobalt, which is sourced almost exclusively at the moment, not wholly, but from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I interviewed Siddharth Kara. He's written a great book called Cobalt Red. He told me during the interview I did with him, he said, the EV makers, I'm quoting here directly, ransacking the Congo. They are participants in this enormous violence, but they look the other way. I mean, these critical minerals and metals are very problematic. And the idea that we're going to suddenly switch our entire economy and only sell EVs, I think, is a dangerous bet on a whole lot of different levels. And it's going to be regressive on the consumer and particularly on the poor and the middle class.
Well, let's talk about what's going to happen with labor when you're looking at the overall economy, because there are literally thousands of people who obviously depend on gasoline-powered cars. And not all those people are going to be able to find jobs with EVs, especially since my understanding is, to the benefit, EVs need a lot less maintenance.
Yeah, you have far fewer moving parts on electric vehicles, mostly batteries and self-contained motors.
You're going to have incredible labor dislocation. I mean, it's going to be a lot worse than blacksmiths looking for new jobs.
Well, and I would add too that remember, I think of the average tradesman, and I'm lucky. I have I don't consider myself rich, but I'm okay. I'm doing pretty well in my life. But what about the carpenters? What about the bricklayers? What about the people who pull trailers? There are issues here that go beyond, that are about class, but are also about workforce and this idea that, like trucks. I've never seen an EV pulling a horse trailer, or a trailer carrying bricks or brush or anything else. What about the working class, the tradesmen that need pickups, that are hauling loads? Electric vehicles are not going to be good for that. And the other thing here is you also have a regional issue. I just was crunching these numbers. Nearly 40% of all the EVs sold in America are sold in California, despite the fact that California only has 12% of the population. I did these numbers. So the top 5 states have 36% of the population, but nearly 60% of the EVs. So why are people in North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, all of which have less than 0.1% of EV sales, they're effectively subsidizing EV sales in California, Florida, Texas, and other states. So there are a lot of issues here that are about equity that are not being talked about.
Well, when you talk, Tim, about equity, one thing is we see about how, heck, in Texas, the price of electricity kilowatt hour goes up and down according to demand. And I can just imagine if the administration is successful and we're all driving EVs, ERCOT and others are going to be raising the price of electricity out of sight, won't they? And how do we stop that?
Right. We've been thinking about costs on the vehicle side, but costs on the fuel side, in this case, electricity, are just as important to think about. Because in tandem with this, the only rationale for doing electric vehicles is that it's a cleaner fuel. Well, that means you really do need to think about grid transition to renewables away from hydrocarbons, fossil fuels, in tandem with all this. And of course, that comes with a cost. But layered on top of all that is the fact that we're not just trying to decarbonize transportation, we're also trying to decarbonize the building sector, as well as much of industry as we can. A lot of that depends on electrification, all of which is going to increase electricity demand at a time we're trying to get off fossil fuels. That'll have upward price pressure on on electricity. So right now on a per mile basis, electric vehicle is cheaper to drive because electricity is cheaper in an electric vehicle on a per mile basis than gasoline is. You know, it's not clear that that'll be true given everything else that's happening on the power grid side.
And that could change in a heartbeat. And does that mean that we need to put more emphasis, perhaps, in encouraging consumers to use renewables, convert to solar power in their homes? That obviously, I guess, would make a difference.
I have solar panels on the roof of my house, but I'm not counting on them to charge my vehicle. But I think the grid questions that Tim brings up are exactly on point. And the Boston Consulting Group just did a study a couple of years ago now. They estimated that I'm reading here, a model utility with 2 to 3 million customers will need to invest between $1,700 and $5,800 in grid upgrades per EV through 2030. I mean, these are big numbers per customer. You're talking a couple $1,000s. And I'm going to repeat what I said before because this is critically important. We don't think about distribution transformers, those cans that you see on the wood poles that are outside your homes, but those are critical infrastructure that convert that high voltage electricity from the main grid to the lower voltage we use in our homes. The wait times for those are 1 to 2 years in some cases. For pad mounted transformers, as long. For high power transformers, the wait can be 2 to 3 years. So the grid upgrades, and I'll add one more quick point here. A couple of years ago, Southern California Edison estimated that they could see an increase in demand on the grid in California of 50% if you see the level of EVs go up as expected. Well, from where is that electricity going to come? You can't build renewables at scale in California today. You can't do it because of the infrastructure constraint.
I agree. There are huge supply chain issues here with expanding power generation. And again, a lot of it is if we weren't thinking about transition to renewables, it wouldn't be on the generation side so much as it's just on the transmission and distribution side. You're getting that power into a neighborhood to the chargers. But we are thinking about transitioning our generation away from carbon intensive forms of power generation to renewables. And so there is a lot going on here. You just think about the land requirements for scaling up renewables, wind and solar, and the local opposition you're seeing to that in many places of the U.S., particularly in the Midwest. These are all real issues that we need to overcome. I'm not saying we can't, but there has to be an honest discussion that this is what must happen to reach these goals.
Look, I think we all agree that we want to lower, emissions, but are we just doing this in too much haste? I mean, you two gentlemen spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm wondering if the government is just pushing it too fast, too hard, and setting itself up for failure.
I'll say that exactly is the exact case here, Jim. I think there's just no doubt about it. And the subsidies that are being pushed forward and the Inflation Reduction Act, which according to Goldman Sachs won't cost, what was it, $350 billion. It could cost $1.2 trillion. I mean, the numbers here are massive. And I was talking with, in fact, Buddy Haston, he's the CEO of the Arkansas Electric Cooperatives the other day. And he was saying, they dropped this massive amount of a bomb of cash onto one part of the economy without thinking about the rest of the supply chains and the other networks that are going to be required to deal with all of this new expected demand and also expected generation. So you've got, as Tim said, this massive amount of cash coming into solar and wind. Well, that has to be connected to the grid somehow, even though it's extraordinarily difficult to build high voltage transmission. And then on the demand side, you're saying, well, we'll electrify all this transportation and convert a lot of our oil demand into electric demand. Well, you're creating two big changes in the grid at the same time. And remember, it took us a century to build the grid we have. The idea that we're going to do this in a few years is just flat wrong.
So, Professor, what do you think about this?
Yeah, well, again, there are two ways of looking at this. One is to stand where we are today and look forward and see all the challenges, and they're real. This is, nothing that I've heard here is, anything I disagree with. The other way is to, stand in 2035 or whatever it happens to be, look backward and say, okay, what do we have to do to get to whatever our goal happens to be? And then, like I said, to be very clear that this is what it requires, whether it be more mining, higher cost of electricity, additional land for renewables. All this comes together. Even different driving behaviors, because that's what charging implies in some cases. So it's a challenge. This is truly a transformation. Is it aspirational? Certainly. You could take an analogous situation, roll back to 2008 with the Energy Independence and Security Act, which was passed by Congress, signed by George Bush when he was president, which called for a very significant increase in biofuel production by the early 2020s. It was about 36 billion gallons a year of renewable fuel, ethanol from corn, and then renewable fuels from other, biomass feedstocks. Did we get there? No. And baked into that legislation and the regulation that followed from it was the ability for the EPA administrator to waive those, regulations, those targets that Congress set year after year after year, which the EPA administrator has done. So is this similar? Yes. Is it the same? No.
I would say it's not quite the same because I need to get in my car and go somewhere.
Right, and this is the key part here, and I'll reiterate a point that I've made now for more than a dozen years, Jim. And if we're serious about decarbonization in the electric grid, and Tim mentioned this idea that we're trying to do two things at once: decarbonize transportation, decarbonize electricity. If we're serious about that, we need to get serious about nuclear energy. We need to do it right damn quick. And we are seeing some changes and positive moves in Washington. There's no doubt about it. We're seeing more bipartisan support, but it isn't nearly enough. And remember, in the Inflation Reduction Act, the amount of money, the tax credits given to nuclear, about $30 billion. Wind and solar got more than 4 times that. So what we are facing is a very well-funded, very influential lobby that is pushing what I think are false promises. Wind and solar, why would we push weather-dependent renewables if we're facing more extreme weather? We need to get serious about nuclear.
Robert, that is a fascinating point, and I've heard so many people recently say, why aren't we putting more emphasis and more investment into nuclear? Tim?
Yes. Advanced nuclear, small modular reactors, which are just starting to emerge, probably a while before they are mature and commercially competitive, but certainly, not putting all of our eggs in one basket, it makes a lot of sense. And I'd add, geothermal to this. There are a lot of, other low carbon, carbon-free technologies we can pursue, even carbon capture with, fossil energy.
I just think it'd be very hard politically for the Biden administration, or frankly, any administration, to start advocating for more nuclear power plants. But Robert, you're there in the heartland of Texas.
I disagree, Jim. I think that this is the what we've seen in Europe in particular now. And I was in Japan just a few weeks ago, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed the energy landscape, and energy security is top of mind. So what I see happening and what I fear is going to happen, and maybe it's just the reality, Europe is going to jump the queue ahead of the U.S. in developing the next generation of nuclear energy because they are under more pressure than the U.S. We have cheaper natural gas. But this could be, and I've said this before, but the problem is, generally speaking, I'm not a partisan. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. But we need the Democratic Party. We need the leader. We need President Biden to say, we need nuclear energy. There's no doubt about it. And the U.S. needs to be more active in approving new mines for uranium and enrichment. All of these things are of a piece, but it's going to require sustained bipartisan federal support for the nuclear sector. And it's what we've seen is some, but it's not nearly robust enough.
We have just another minute or two. And Robert, I'd like you to respond briefly a bit more about the Texas grid, because
Sure.
Here we are in Dallas and we remember awfully well what happened in February of 21. Is the Texas grid taking the steps needed so that it could absorb the high demand? And I give you a minute.
Sure. Well, there are bills now in the Texas legislature. The Senate has passed a bill, I think it's SB 6, that would address some of this, but it's going to cost consumers. And this is one of the things that I think we're seeing the fallout from the deregulation push of the Texas grid that happened now more than 20 years ago. Has it been good for consumers? I don't think it has. I think what we've seen is that there is, when it comes to reliability, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. And so now the legislature is trying to address that. Will the measures they're talking about now be enough? I'm not smart enough to know yet, Jim. We will tell. We will find out if there's another Winter Storm Uri in a year or two, and then we'll know for sure. But right now, the Texas grid is okay, right? But we haven't had that extreme weather event to really test it.
So we opened the program where I asked you, Robert, about the title of your article. It's time to unplug the hype over electric vehicles. Professor, if you were writing an article today, what's the title?
Unplug the hype. Maybe we need to plug in and get going, because there's a lot that has to be done to get to these goals. If we agree that this is what we want to do, then, like I said, we need to be very clear about what that entails, and make those decisions as a society.
What car do you drive?
I have a Honda Insight, a hybrid.
A hybrid. And Robert?
Oh, I have 3 vehicles, and all of them burn old dyno juice. I got a 2006 Toyota pickup, an '05 4Runner, which I just put a new engine in, by the way, a crate engine. So I'm keeping that one for a long time. And I have a 2012 Acura sedan. So
okay.
I use gasoline, and I'm happy I do.
and I'm still driving my old Subaru, so that's good. Thanks so much. I think we've raised a lot of important questions, and we can always follow you, Robert, on your podcast, right? Is that a weekly podcast?
It is a weekly podcast, the Power Hungry Podcast, and on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com.
Okay, you got your commercial in. Professor, thanks so much for being with us today. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Transition to a cleaner environment and lower carbon emissions are, as we've heard, laudable goals. To go back to an earlier age, we may be putting the cart before the horse. Hype may sell cars, but equal, if not more, attention is required to ensure that the infrastructure, namely charging stations and electrical power, are sufficient, or we may just find ourselves wishing that we still had the keys to our old, reliable gas guzzler. Thanks for being a part of our program, where we talk about things that matter with people who care. See you next time.